Bob Uecker, the legendary, that's a word that gets thrown around a lot, the legendary broadcaster for the Milwaukee Brewers. He was so much more than that, but also very much that. He passed away at the age of 90 on Thursday. And there are a million different places you can go with Ueck. You could fill a million podcasts with his impact and his legacy and his life. To be blunt, to 29-year-olds who grew up on the East Coast, we are not the best people to tell you about Bob Uecker. We are in some ways because we're goofy baseball souls, as Ueck certainly was. But we did not grow up listening to him as Brewers fans. We are a little too young to have experienced him as a national figure. And so our intake of Ueck, at least for me, like I listen to a lot of games on the radio, right? So that's kind of how I was like, dang, this dude for the Brewers is a really old and unique voice. And then from there, you kind of figure out who Bob Uecker is. So Jordan, I'll just kick you the rock now. Like, what were your touch points with Bob Uecker?
Yeah, so I think when someone of this status, of course, you know, we've talked about iconic baseball figures that have passed away on this show, whether they are players or broadcasters or figures in the sport. And what's interesting to me about Uecker is, I mean, you know, you make it to 90, that's a life, that's a full life. And then, you know, we could talk about how long he was doing it and how much he accomplished. But I think that's also why when you see, of course, anytime, you know, we lose someone like this, it's very sad and heartbreaking is the word you see. But so much of what I think was so, you know, emotionally impactful about losing someone like this is because he was still so around and so involved and not just still doing the job, but still such a huge part of a community. I mean, he is Milwaukee baseball through and through, and anyone doing any job in anywhere, but certainly in this industry for this long, certainly says something about the person. But if that was all we were saying, if that's all that Bob Uecker was, you know, a broadcaster for over half a century, like that would be amazing. And that he had this whole other life as an actor, as a media superstar in an era before, you know, we even really knew what that meant, is also part of what makes his life so astonishing.
So let's kind of just speed run the big points of Bob Uecker's unbelievable time on this planet. You know, raised in and around Milwaukee. And I think it was in an article from Adam McCalvey at MLB.com about how just like Ueck didn't like school. And so he discovered pretty early that wasn't going to be his path. Plays ball, is like a pretty good slugging catcher in the minor leagues, comes up with the Braves at the time in Milwaukee, plays for, I believe, 5 years, 1962 to 1967 with the Braves, Phillies, and Cardinals, and is like not that good. Hits 14 home runs in his career. 3 of them are off Hall of Famers, including Sandy Koufax. So badass. And then he retires. And you're like, how many different players have that career? Like, he was Austin Wynns. Right?
Right. You can find a lot of catchers who accomplished a lot more than Bob Uecker on the field that were immediately obscure, anonymous from the second they played their last major league game.
He was Geronimo Heel, right? He was like a couple good years as a backup and like, thanks for showing up. Now, he was a little different than that because he was a character during his career. Famously, he got in trouble for playing a tuba during pregame on the field before Game 2 of, I think, the 1964 World Series. Like,
we love that.
Got
more
him
tuba.
in some hot water.
We need more tuba.
The biggest tuba-related moment in baseball history, I think, easily.
Yeah,
I can't think of another.
Yeah,
tough to top that tuba-wise. So then he hangs him up, right? And he just begins this whole other life. He starts as the Brewers broadcaster in 1971. And, the Brewers show up in Milwaukee in 1970. So Uecker never actually plays for the Brewers. They moved from Seattle, where they were the Pilots, not the Pirates. That would have been so confusing to cover ball at the time. A Pilots-Pirates game. So they moved to Milwaukee in 1970, and like the departure of the Milwaukee Braves to Atlanta is still like fresh. And so one narrative I've seen from some people who were around it a lot more is that Uecker kind of helps the city fall back in love with baseball, a sport that had been kind of ripped away from them. And there was a lack of trust that a team might stay for the long haul. And Uecker becomes broadcaster in year 2 and continues working, doing games for them until the most recent Brewers game. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. He called the most recent Brewers game. And he was the Brewers. I mean, the only living broadcaster with a statue outside the stadium?
Believe so. Yeah. And he's just, again, still showing up. Is not just still doing the job. And again, like I was saying before, that he could simultaneously launch this career outside of his baseball broadcasting, where he's in movies and he's all these different things.
He's like on Johnny Carson all the time.
Just like all nonstop. Like, it's just things that don't compute, right? It's like a crossover that just doesn't exist anymore. We often talk about baseball figures that cross over into the mainstream media, and he did that in such a powerful way for such a long time, and still was, to the point where he was still one of the most recognizable baseball adjacent things on the planet.
It kind of feels like how Jason Kelce is right now. Where
I don't even know what the comp is, because like I said, we just don't have baseball analogs anymore that are like this. And obviously media has changed a lot since he was on Johnny Carson all the time.
Right. Wins the Ford Frick Award and enters the Hall of Fame in 2003. He was in Major League, which is where the just a bit outside line, which is, I mean, you hear that every day that he came up with that, said it in Major League. And this is a triumphant existence. It really, that is the word I
that's a great word for it. Yeah.
Because, I just mentioned, what is our touchstone, our touch point to someone like this, right? It's hard to pin down. And I was struggling to kind of think about it before I read an article by a friend of the show, Grant Brisbee, over at The Athletic, about how Bob Uecker embodied this idea that baseball is supposed to be a good time.